Good morning and welcome to the EGP Global Malaysia series. The Global Malaysia series was put together with the aim of inspiring Malaysians to enter the global market, showcasing some of the most internationally successful Malaysian businesses, brands, and products. Now, we had several of these sessions covering industries like plantations, retail, aviation, banking, and telcos last year. Now, this is the first for the year, and after last year's topics, we aptly begin the first session with this topic: are we there yet? Now, why? The days of ultra-low interest rates and easy money that have powered emerging market growth these past 6 years are coming to an end. Growing abroad remains necessary, perhaps more important than ever before, but domestic stability is number one priority for governments and policymakers around the world today. And that's because before a country can export its biggest and brightest companies, its house must first be in order. A nation's stability, its strength is, after all, built on its fiscal foundations. And thankfully, Malaysia has begun on this journey, but will it have the courage to see it through all the way through? And what are the challenges out of its control? To discuss this issue from three different prisms, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Dr. Federico Gil-Sander of the World Bank, Stuart Dean, CEO of General Electric Southeast Asia, Senator Dato' Sri Idris Jala, CEO of Pemandu, representing Malaysia's government. And this session is moderated by BFM's Kusu Chuang. Without further ado, let's begin. Chuang, over to you.
Thank you, Frida. Thanks. Gentlemen, last year and in the preceding 2 or 3 years, emerging markets were very much all the rage. Lots of money flowed into this part of the world, Indonesia, India, Malaysia included. But in the wake of the taper by the Federal Reserve in May, this hot money flowed out of the region. India was not spared, Indonesia was not spared, stock markets tumbled, currencies tumbled. Malaysia was said to be on the cusp of being sold down, and there was some selling, but it was not to be so, and Malaysia was spared the blushes. Clearly, lots of reasons as to why Malaysia was spared from the point of view of the governments, but perhaps if we can start with you, Dato' Idris. In your mind, what were the chief reasons why Malaysia was spared the brunt of the selling?
I think people look at what we're doing in Malaysia as a country, and we made promises about what we're trying to do to transform the economy. Clearly, in terms of that, we have delivered on those promises. You can see we started off by saying we want to make the most of what we have today. And over the last 4 years, actually, private investment grew by 17% CAGR. So before the economic transformation program, the private investment grew annually at around 3.1%. So when you see private investment really growing at 17% in the last 4 years, it tells you one thing, Chuang. It tells you that the private sector is confident in the country and they're putting real money into it. So that's first point. The second point is that you can see Malaysia standing on the World Bank's good. We have Federico here. When we first started, we were number 23 in the world in terms of ease of doing business. We jumped to number 6 last year. For the first time, we're ahead of the UK in terms of ease of doing business. So clearly the proof of the pudding is the private sector have confidence in Malaysia, so they're putting the money, 17.5% increase in private investment annually over the last 4 years. And so it is borne down by the fact that the ease of doing business is really there in Malaysia. And so our fiscal reform has been successful too. When we first started in 2009, our deficit stood at 6.6% of GDP. In 2010, we cut that down to 5.6% of GDP. And then 2011, 4.8% of GDP. And then 4.5%. And last year, we were actually below 4%, 3.9% of GDP. So what we promised to do by cutting our fiscal deficit, we've actually stayed the course and actually delivered it. And so you're looking at the GNI targets. When we started, our gross national income per capita at the time in the year 2009 stood at $7,059 per capita. And as of last year, by December, we already moved to US dollars per capita, 10,060. So that is actually 42% growth in GNI per capita. If we follow the World Bank's definition threshold for what constitutes a high-income economy, that's 15,000 US dollars per capita. By the year 2020, we did the projections and the maths. If the world was linear, it is quite clear if we do the same kind of momentum, Malaysia could achieve the target of becoming a high-income economy earlier than expected, which is probably around 2018. Now, returning back to the question, if you look at Malaysia and wrote a scorecard on it, on the basis of what we promised, it is quite clear. People would say, yeah, these guys, we give them credit for making those promises and actually staying the course and delivering, and the results there to speak for it. And that is why actually World Bank is writing a case study on it. Harvard has written a case study on our ETP. Princeton has written one on the government transformation program. And so many other countries, including Tanzania, is following the same pathways as Malaysia. So clearly there is a lot of, if you like, very positive vibes around what we're doing here in Malaysia. Thank you.
Dr. Federico, a rise of 42% in GNI per capita terms is quite a big deal. But when set against the context of Malaysia's fiscal position and in terms of the household debt situation, those numbers seem to be still rather high. But you have said in the past that people are sometimes a little bit too alarmist when it comes to high debt levels when a country is growing and its population is also expanding in terms of income. We shouldn't be too concerned about debt levels. Can you expand on that?
Thank you. I think that with respect to the household debt, I mean, of course, there's always a level that it does become concerning, and I think that Bank Negara has been instituting a lot of policies in terms of trying to ensure that people cannot acquire more debt than they can reasonably afford. But if we just look at the raw numbers, that may not give us the right idea as to whether the levels are, what is a level that is too high. Because in a country where the household income is also growing, I mean, you mentioned the GNI per capita, which is a very macro number. But when we look at the household income, the results have also been quite good between 2009 and 2012 when they've looked at the household income surveys. So as long as the household incomes are growing, as long as there is wage growth in the economy, people, they can actually service their debts. And so to be able to buy new cars, buy a house, and then as long as your income continues to grow and you can service the debt, it's not necessarily such a bad thing. And the other point is that Malaysia is a country that actually has a fairly good financial sector where most people have access to finance. So in some cases, if a country has a very low level of household debt, that might actually reflect the fact that the population doesn't have access to financial services, whereas in Malaysia they do. That's not to say that that the debt level can double and reach 300% of GDP, that everything is okay. And I think that Bank Negara recognizes that it's important to make sure that responsible lending standards are put in place so that people cannot borrow more than what they can service. I mean, people do tend to be more optimistic about their ability to earn sometimes than what the reality turns out to be.
Stuart,
can I chip in here on household debt? It is a concern, I think, the level of household debt, but it's not alarming. The reason why I say that is, if you take a look at the numbers today, household debt is around 86% of our GDP. But the point that I want to mention here is that household asset is 320% of GDP. Now, when you look at household debt, you borrow money on the basis of what your asset values are. Asset values for household is to do with real estate property, and that is also included inside there is our EPF money and plus many other things. So to add it all together, the numbers actually, it says that our household assets are at 320% of GDP. Yes, of course, the borrowing is high, but as I said, Federico had said, Malaysia is easy doing business. We are number one in the world for getting credit. Number one in the world for getting credit. So if you're number one in getting credit, it's easy to borrow money. If it's easy to borrow money, you make sure that is there good collateral? Are the property prices on the rise? Are the assets healthy? And if the assets are healthy, it's okay. So as I said, the household assets are at 320% of our GDP. So that's, I would say it's a concern, but it's not alarming.
Stuart, international corporations don't come much bigger than General Electric. And when you view any emerging market as a potential investment destination, you, I'm sure, look upon many different factors: geopolitical risk, economic and credit risk, currency stability, etc., etc. When you assess Malaysia based on these metrics, and as when you look at Malaysia's debt levels, what is your broad consensus view about this country and the direction it's going in terms of addressing its debt as well as managing its own growth?
Sure. I think Malaysia is a very attractive country for a company like GE. Dr. Sri talked about the solid government policies. In GE, we talk about kind of say-do ratio. When a government says they're going to do something in Malaysia, you can pretty much count on the government doing it. And so that's important to a company like GE when we make investment decisions. The growth rates remain attractive. The government deficit, I think, is under control and being addressed, as I'm sure we'll talk more about. And I think GE's the best indicator is how good has our experience been in the past, and we've had very good experiences with our investments in Malaysia, and that's why we continue to invest here.
Gentlemen, the oft-quoted refrain when it comes to Malaysia, and in fact its neighbors such as Singapore, when it comes to attracting the high-level stuff, the sexy stuff, the innovation-led stuff. Dato' Idris, perhaps you can start with this. You've said in the past that reaching 2020 with our GNI targets being met is no concern, but structurally going beyond that to perhaps one day build the next Samsung or one day to build the next Apple. Now that could be an area where structurally Malaysia is not set up to perhaps achieve. And from the talent standpoint, what do you think Malaysia needs to do to get up to speed on this front?
Yeah. Thank you. A country and an economy is very much similar to a business. If I put the analogy, if you run a business and you want to make it succeed, I always believe that the first step you need to do to make the business prosper is to make the most of what you have. So your existing business, and a country is like that too. We need to make the most of what we have in the sectors that are already existing. Oil and gas, how do you get more oil and gas out from the ground? Oil palm, how you get tourism. All of those are what's called making the most of what you have. Then the second part of what you need to do is to grow from where you are on those existing stuff. That is part two. Now the third one is the sexy stuff, breaking new grounds, the next Samsung, and all of those things. I believe that countries like businesses, you don't jump into the sexy stuff until you have successfully made the most of what you have and again new businesses in the existing sectors. What we're doing in Malaysia is to make sure between now and the year 2020, we make the most of what we already have. We know there are 12 national key economic sectors, the ones that we really think we can make a lot more GNI, a lot more corporate wealth, country wealth from those areas. We need to expand that, but we need to keep an eye on the future, which is breaking new grounds in terms of innovation. Therein lies the area that I believe still a lot more work for us to do. Now, returning back to the point that you raised, Chuan, because we have been, for a long time, putting a lot of emphasis on what we traditionally have, our existing commodity-based economy, and a lot of our talents are in that area. So when you start to jump into breaking new ground, you really need to make sure that you have to groom the talent to be equipped to deal with that stuff. And so that is why we started this Global Malaysia series. And we wanted to make sure we have a dialogue in Malaysia about what we needed to do post-2020. And we are now making the most of what we have today. But I do structurally believe that Malaysia has to change the way we look at the country post-2020. I'm no doubt in my mind, if we continue on the current path, we will achieve our high-income economy status by 2020. But then the question is, what next? How do we grow beyond that? Therefore, the Global Malaysia series is a dialogue to begin shaping policy in that area. And I do hope that the 11 Malaysia plan will begin to put some of those things in there so that we will then make those changes for Malaysia post-2020.
Dr. Federico, the World Bank, interestingly, does not view Malaysia's debt levels as too alarming. Rather, you have said that by far and away your biggest concern for Malaysia is the talent or lack thereof. Kindly explain.
You know, I want to pick up on what Dato' Sri was saying about how the first step is to actually pick up on the assets that you have. So Malaysia is blessed with a lot of natural resources, and I think that it makes sense to make the most out of what you have and manage those resources well. And I think that in that regard, I mean, Malaysia is clearly a success story. But if you want to create the next Samsung, the next Apple, you need a different type of asset and different kind of capital, which is human capital and human assets. And the way that Korea came up to having the next Samsung is because they really boosted their level of education, starting from the rural areas, the poor performing schools, and really brought that up to international standards very quickly. And they moved to having actually now a problem with too many people in university. In Malaysia, only about 30% of the people actually go to university. In Korea, that's almost 100% of the young people. So there needs to be a very radical transformation, even in the quantity of human capital that Malaysia will need to be able to have the human capital stock, to have that as an asset of the economy from where investments can leverage on. And also when we look at the issue of the quality of education, that's another great concern, especially looking at basic education, where you have some of the competitors like Vietnam, which is a much poorer country. Malaysia is about $10,000 GNI per capita. Vietnam is less than $5,000. But Vietnamese students, both in cities and in rural areas, actually perform better than Malaysian students. And that to me is something that should be very alarming to Malaysia. It's much more alarming than that situation. When we look at the next Samsung, I was just driving on Tun Razak today and I see a building from Huawei, the Chinese company. And then you see that, in China you have the top school system in the world in Shanghai that actually has the highest scores in these global tests, better than the US, better than in Finland. And they are actually, maybe on track to creating the next Samsung. So I think that if Malaysia by 2020 wants to have that kind of human capital base, the time to start is really now. I mean, the more you wait, forming human capital takes a generation. So to me, that's the biggest challenge and something that needs to be done, starting right away.
Stuart, I'm afraid this next question comes to you then, because despite spending Malaysia something like 55 billion ringgit a year on the Ministry of Education, clearly we have not made the same kind of traction that we would like. Now, unfortunately, this country and the education system is overly tinged with race and religion. Now, in your quest to perhaps expand in this region, perhaps springboarding from Malaysia, what do you think Malaysia's legislators need to do to address the huge issue of talent, and not just the origination of talent, but the drainage of talent as well?
That's a difficult question. I'll stall a little bit, if I may, by trying to answer the previous question about sexy investments. I think there are some sexy things going on in Malaysia, and that shows that there is a lot of talent in Malaysia that can develop these things. I'll give you a couple of examples. We're working with Petronas. Petronas will be the first company in the world to develop a floating LNG plant. And it's a great cooperation with GE, where we're collaborating with Petronas on developing the technology there. And along those same lines, we're putting in a third remote diagnostics and services center to serve the GE global oil and gas business here in KL. It'll be the only one in Asia. And we've got great talent. And that's going to lead to analyzing tons of data in order to better improve operations, not only for Petronas, but for oil and gas companies around the world. So there's so many of the entry point programs that are truly innovative. We have one in our healthcare business around remote scanning and diagnostics. It's not easy, it's breaking new ground, and we're still working on it. But I think there's a lot of great things going on, and I would say generally GE has been able to find great talent in Malaysia. Is there enough talent to get to the next level? That there's probably every country has a huge challenge to make that happen, including my own in the United States. We're really a relatively small percentage of students graduate from really world-class universities. So a lot of work to do here in Malaysia, but I mean that's true everywhere.
Stuart, just another follow-up question. In the context of your plans in, say, 10 years' time, and if Malaysia does not get its act together, how much of a deal breaker do you think it is if you cannot find the requisite levels of talent that you require in your corporation from a local perspective?
Well, that would certainly depress our investment spending if that were Malaysia or any other country where we're operating. However, I think the government has a role to play, but private companies also have a role to play, making sure that we're linked to universities. Just in the last couple of years here in Malaysia, we're working with a number of of universities on internship programs, curriculum development, making sure that we're helping the universities to graduate students that can seamlessly join a company like GE. So I think we all have to work together. I mean, at the end of the day, I think meritocracy is what's required in any educational system, and that the best students should be able to compete and go wherever they want.
Dr. Idris, going on from what Stuart was saying, and in terms of, perhaps a company like Sapporo Kencana, which has proven itself in a very specific oil and gas industry, the initiative really must be on a much broader basis. And I'm going to cite your having attended the Penang Skills Development Corporation, where having spent something like 7 million ringgit, they've originated 180,000 graduates, of which almost all are fully employed. Now, that's, of course, a vocational initiative. But what do you think Malaysia can do, and will it do, to get to those kinds of ratios on a spend basis?
The Penang Skills Development Center is actually a very good example of a pathfinder institution that shows how to do it. It's been there for a few years now, maybe I can't remember, 10 years or so. The government put in something like 70 million ringgit only in terms of grants that it provides to the Penang Skill Development Center. But the curriculum, everything that's done there, the whole institution is tripartite cooperation within the government, academia, in this case USM, and also the private sector, more importantly in that area, in the electrical and electronics business. Now, we spent 70 million altogether over the period, and the total number of graduates successfully 100% employed, 180,000, that's the one you mentioned. If you do the maths, 70 million divided by 180,000, that is actually a little more than 300 ringgit per graduate, all employed, 100% employment. And their pay is even higher than the normal graduates coming from normal university. So that, to me, is a pathfinder project. Now, if that works there, clearly, there is a possibility of expanding something like that elsewhere. We have more than 1,000 institutions that do vocational and skills training across the country, and we spend a lot of money on them. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are mediocre. I think it's huge mixed bags. If you think about the future for Malaysia moving into breaking new grounds on innovation, we need to find an innovative way to do that, to bring the talent. And this is a pathfinder institution that has successfully been doing it. And of course, the private sector put in the money. The guys come out there and learn engineering or all sorts of stuff. But they do vocational training in the factories. So that, I think, is the way forward for Malaysia. 3.3 million jobs, we said we will need to create between now and the year 2020. 46% of those jobs, we forecast them to be requiring vocational and technical training. And so therefore, there's a lot of need for doing that in Malaysia. I have no doubt in my mind there are people in this country that can step up to that challenge. Returning back to Frederico's point about overall education. That is why we launched the National Education Blueprint. That's a blueprint to address drastically the way we shape the future generation in this country. So we're beginning with all the work that is needed at primary and secondary school, including right up to tertiary. And there are fundamental issues that we need to confront. I'll give you one example to give evidence how serious the government is in looking at this. We have 70,000 teachers that teach English in our schools in Malaysia, 70,000 teachers. And we had to get all of them to sit for the English test, Cambridge placement test. And if you were to do something like that in the UK and get all the English teachers who've been teaching for 10 to 20 years to ask them to sit for the test, I think you have them all in the street on strike. But we did it here in Malaysia. Last year we got all 70,000. Unfortunately, 70% of them didn't quite meet the standards that we require. That's a fundamental issue. We know them by name too now. So it's not a theoretical point. We know who passed it, who didn't pass it. So with the work and the help of British Council, we've now gotten all of them to then attend night classes, weekend classes. In fact, for the first 6 to 8 months, they've gone through remedial classes. 75% of them have improved their scores by 1 point, by one notch rather. So that's actually good and very encouraging work so far. But I'm saying that was as one. There are 11 shifts in the National Education Blueprint. Tremendous attention has to be put in to execute this well, for us to make sure that the future of Malaysia is then sustainable going forward.
Can I just quickly, I mean, one of the things that I really admire in terms of Pamando's work is making sure that things are measured and that we have, you know, that you test the teachers, you rank the schools. I think that one of the areas, if I can urge in terms of what is very important for improving education, is improving the quality of the teachers, especially at entry. Right, you have the teaching workforce that you have to do the best that you can to improve their skills, but also trying to make at entry, really selecting the best students to be the graduates. So I think that collecting more information, publishing more information about the quality of the teachers that are entering, I think that will also help create a discipline that you're only really taking the best into the teaching profession.
Totally agree. Of the 11 shifts, one of them is the quality of teachers. That's absolutely key. And if we get the right screening criteria and we weed out those who are not there, shouldn't be there, then I think that's a good starting point. We have 400,000 teachers. So out from 1.4 million civil servants, 400,000 of them are teachers. Now that's a big number. So it is very important that these 400,000 teachers are really punching above their weight, because the future of Malaysia hinges on the quality of what happens in the classroom. That's absolutely key. And indeed, we now have tremendous data point on all the teachers. For example, if the two of you are teaching both history and geography in Kuala Lumpur, say primary 4, assuming both history and geography, if all the kids fail geography in your class for the last 4 years, but they do very well in history, and Stuart is the opposite, we know that for a fact. Actually, one of the very simple intervention is, if you're good in geography, you just teach geography. Don't do history. And that was all that was needed. So all these data points that we have had now, we were able to then get the teachers and the principal to begin to do that, because we were talking theoretically about the subjects without getting it down at the name teacher level. And when you get it down, there are some very simple things you can do without spending a lot of money on it. So, Frederico, I think the point is this. You can't do improvement to 400,000 teachers until you address it at the name teacher level. That is absolutely key to what we do. We now know there are 10,000 teachers in this country. We know which schools are number one, which is the worst. Therefore, for what it's worth, it'd be interesting to say for the whole of Sabah and the whole of Sarawak, you would be amazed to discover there's one school that is the best performing school in the whole of Sabah and Sarawak. That's Ulu Lubai School. It's an Iban school, very rural, and the parents are not well-to-do, very rural, but it's better than any of the schools in Kuching, better than any of the schools in Cebu, and etc. Why? Because the quality of the teachers in those classrooms made all the difference. To me, that's absolutely critical.
Senator, Dato' Idris, perhaps this question to you. I mean, how is it possible that the government, the Ministry of Education, which receives the biggest allocation of funds at Budget 2014, 55 billion ringgit or something, can still continue to produce such a staggering percentage of inadequacy at 70%, and which of course raises the specter of leakages. And the second question again is, what is the chances of the government reverting to the use of English as the medium of instruction for the two most important disciplines, which is mathematics and science?
I think when we shifted into Bahasa as the main medium of instruction, that is good. I mean, that many countries do that they push their own national curriculum. But if you start doing that, you must make sure alongside that you strengthen the quality of English as a subject. And that's, I think, the point that I think we didn't do as well as we should. And to me, there is tremendous need to do that. We recognize that. And the program now to strengthen the teaching of English in all schools in Malaysia, both at primary and secondary school. Coming back to the point about ensuring we have the very best teachers, and that is critical for us moving forward. We must remember now, in today's day and age, the use of technology as one of the tools that is readily available. 20 years ago, technology wasn't really there. In Stanford, they now realize that one lecturer, instead of teaching in one classroom, you can then use all his teaching methods and then put them through the system so that they can share that across to many other students. So in Malaysia, we've now acquired the tool that they use in the UK called Frog. So that tool is then, we now try to populate that to make sure that we have all the teaching methods that is done by the best teachers in the country, and then we put it there. It can then be shared to rural places and other places like that. And so when we start using technology to make this happen, I think that's a really important breakthrough project for us to improve quality of education. So it's a transition to make sure you share the very best teaching techniques of the best teachers across the country, because it takes a long time to improve the quality of the 400,000 teachers. You can't go and remove all of the ones that are no good immediately overnight. There's nobody in the classroom. And so you really need to make sure that we have to transition our way towards better quality teachers in the classroom.
Stuart, this must come as music to your ears, because let's just say extrapolating to 10 years' time, and GE is involved in a whole plethora of industries, whether it's defense or aviation or infrastructure or clean energy. Now, where do you think Malaysia has the best chance of building the next global giant if all goes well in the education sector?
I don't think there's a limit to that. You know, Malaysia already has a very wide array of industries that it competes in, sometimes domestically, but many times internationally. So they can grow from those strong bases going forward. The talent obviously is key to make that happen. I think oil and gas, clearly a huge strength. Petronas is a world-class company. They're building an ecosystem here in Malaysia that will continue to grow and develop national champions. We talked about Sapura Kencana. There are many others. Bumi Armada. I think the same thing in aviation. The boom in commercial aviation with the emergence of AirAsia here in the region has led to many new jobs, and will grow MRO capabilities. GE is involved in the only commercial engine repair and overhaul facility. We'll see more investments in that space going forward. Healthcare, as the middle class continues to grow in Malaysia, there'll be significant investments really demanded by the population for better healthcare, and that will enable lots of new companies to happen. We see what's happening in the developed countries like the United States and Europe. Biotechnology is one of the hottest areas, and I definitely see that growing here in Malaysia.
Dr. Sander, the joinder you earlier mentioned with regards to Malaysia's high debt levels was the fact that it still needs to address its fiscal position. And given where Malaysia is right now, and the oft-quoted refrain in this sphere has always been the political will to see through the measures or the lack thereof, how would you rate Malaysia's actions in this regard, let's say the last 9 months?
In the last 9 months, I think we can rate Malaysia quite well. I think that if we look in the last 10 years, I think that what we were discussing before is that you want to make sure that you rebuild the buffers, that you have the right buffers for when you're hit with a crisis. When the economy is hit with a shock, as was the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the fact that the deficit was 6.6% of GDP in 2009, that's what governments need to do when there is a shock to the economy. The question is, what do you do afterwards when the shock starts to dissipate and the economy starts growing again? You need to rebuild the buffer so that when there is a next shock, which is outside of Malaysia's control, the government can again run 6-7% or however much it needs in order to keep the economy going. So for that, it needs to keep the debt on a declining trajectory. We didn't see so much of that in the mid-2000s. The debt levels remained stable despite the economy still growing 4 or 5%. And in recent years, it has also been quite sticky and a bit difficult for the debt levels to come down. In the last 9 months, specifically, I think that we've seen a lot more resolution in terms of ensuring that the level will finally enter a declining path starting this year. and committing to reducing the deficit gradually over time, precisely to rebuild these buffers that are so important. And if I may quickly, I think that since this is also a fiscal question, you asked about why the budget for the Ministry of Education can be very high and that's not translating into some of the outcomes. And we talk a lot about the need to build human capital. And I think that it's true that, for example, in the area of education, a lot more efficiency can be obtained as opposed to spending more to actually get more out of the existing spending. And one of the ways that when we look at the Malaysia system, one of the reasons that we hypothesize as to why the spending is not translating into outcomes is that it's a very centralized system. And I think that the blueprint recognizes that more of the power needs to be moved to the principals, it needs to be moved to the school level so that the schools can make some of their own decisions in terms of how to best allocate, how to best decide on the curriculum, how to best allocate resources, and also to move more information to the parents. What we were talking about, knowing the quality of the teachers in terms of how well they teach English, how well the schools are doing compared to the school next door, so that with that information the schools can demand of their principals and the school leaders they deliver a better quality of education. These are very difficult things to change when you have a very centralized system, but those are things that can actually have material improvements without actually increasing the spend on education.
Dr. Idris, you mentioned in the past, and we have seen this, Malaysians have been bombarded by a whole series of cost increases, from assessment rates to toll rate increases, bus fares, sugar, etc., etc. But you have mentioned in the past that perhaps we should have two baskets when it comes to rationalizing our structural reforms, which is the essential to-do list, which will move the needle, and the other basket, which is the less essential items. Now, clearly Malaysia should do this and prioritize its rationalization measures. Which to you are the most important, which is the most components of the basket in the to-do list, essential, and what is the ability of the government to prioritize this?
Thank you for that. My response is very predictable. I always believe that we must do the things that move the needle, make the difference. Of course, it's easy to say, put everything up. I mean, even the small things. But I think if you did so, there's a great tendency for those little increases to be so irritating to the public that so the big ones, we wouldn't even have the courage to do them. And so I'm of the view that we should really focus on the ones that really make the contribution to the fiscal position of the country. Petrol, diesel, those are the things, electricity, those are the things that really significantly move the needle. There are many other things that are, yes, they need to do them, but they are small in comparison. And take the example of where in the world would you go to a government hospital and you pay RM1 and then you get 3 months of medicine, only in Malaysia. And the last time we paid that RM1 hospital charge was 1982. That's a long time ago. But, to increase that by a few cents, you get everyone riled up. In the end, we cannot even do the petrol increase. That's where the real things are. So returning back to the point, the first basket is those things that move the needle. I think we should focus on doing this. All the KL rates assessment that belong to the second basket. All the bus fares and little things, quite irritating to the public. I think we must focus on the things that really make the difference. Returning back to the point, I think when you look at the health of an economy, we cannot see it from purely one dimension, one ruler. You need to see two rulers. Let me introduce the subject of the two rulers. I call it the matrix. On the y-axis of the matrix is called the national debt, the government debt as a percentage of GDP. So that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, it's the fiscal position, either you're in a surplus or a deficit as a percentage of GDP. So you picture the chart. If you are good as a country, you must make sure that you have your debt levels below, a lot lower than 100% on the y-axis. But you do not want to be in the deficit mode that's greater than 10%. So those countries that are greater than 100% debt level, that are negative in terms of fiscal deficit, at negative more than 10%, they are in what's called the sovereign crisis level. That's when you become bankrupt. Malaysia is nowhere near that. When we first started, our debt levels is still below many other countries. Greece is 100%, even the UK is 80%, and France 81%, thereabout. And Japan is outside the curve, 190%. Singapore, interestingly enough, is 100%. But you know why they're not in trouble? Because they are surplus. It's just like you can borrow money, but if you can have the capability to repay, it's okay to borrow money. And so in the case of Singapore, they borrow a lot of money, but they are actually in a fiscal position that is surplus. And so when we were in Malaysia, we were at the wrong end of the stick. We didn't want to go there. If you look at that chart, actually, we've been moving every single year for the last 4 years, inching into the safe zone. That means safe zone is negative 4% or surplus. That is at the border. And then that we believe that in the safe zone, you have to have a debt level less than around 60%. And Malaysia is actually inching there. Some of the countries that are really struggling, you see India and also Indonesia, they now lately have difficulty with this outflow of capital going out simply because they are current account deficit. When you are in current account deficit, you really have a problem. And so Malaysia, we are surplus at current account, but at the total account, we are reducing that gradually. As I said, negative 6.6, 5.6, 4.8, 4.5, 3.9. So we're moving all inching in the right direction. So the key here is that never look at the fiscal position of a country in one single dimension, the debt level alone, because if you did so, you'll conclude that Singapore is they're in trouble, they're not in trouble, because you need to look at it two dimension, X and Y axis. If you are surplus, it's okay to borrow. But if you don't have surplus, then it's not okay to borrow. It's as simple as that. I sit on the World Economic Forum, and there are about 30 people all across the world on a panel to try and search for what is the right economic model for the whole world in terms of new growth model. Clearly, we are of the view that going forward, countries need to be multidimensional in viewing the position of a country. At the same time, you need to look at high income, inclusiveness, and sustainability, much the same as the new economic model. It's exactly the same. They didn't use the word inclusiveness. They wanted a better word called inclusivity. But it means the same thing. But it's much the same. But it's not, you can sit down and ask yourself the question until your face is blue. You come to the same point. A country that is good must be a country that is high income. At the same time, it must be inclusive. And at the same time, it must be sustainable. So that is the key. And we have a good model going forward. And I do believe that if Malaysia pushes the boundaries and keep doing what we're doing, but returning back to the point about quality of education, critical, and absolutely critical. But need to think about how do we move into the sexy stuff beyond the making the most of what we have.
Dato', you point out the fact that the trajectory is correct, and it is correct, but it's a long-term game, and with the Prime Minister's approval ratings on the wane, and the fiscal, the structural reforms having to take a long time, this is a long-term game. How highly would you rate the chances of the political will to remain a status quo for the medium to long term?
You see, there is no gain without pain. So when we say we want to improve our country fiscally, we have to take some painful measures. The subsidy rationalization, clearly, I think one way or another, it contributed to a negative view of what our Prime Minister is. But to me, that's the right thing to do. We have to take some of those difficult measures. In fact, when we started to do some of the increases lately, we are really looking at CPI, the Consumer Price Index. For those that don't know it, there are more than 800 items in the Consumer Price Index basket, 800 items. And for those who don't know it, the Department of Stats, on a monthly basis, in fact weekly, they do a survey based on 13,000 retail stores across the country, from Kota Belud, Kuala Lipis, to Murudu, everywhere, 13,000. So the total number of data points, actually, that they're getting out, more than 80,000 data points. So I think the last month cost of living survey, despite all the hoo-ha that's going on around, the CPI is only risen by 3.5%. It's lower than many, many other countries in the region, actually. Now, I know people always want to say, yeah, but I went to that shop and I found kembung price higher than that shop. I think that's anecdotal way of doing it. It's not the right way to do it. You need to take the 800 items, poll 13,000 retail outlets, That's how you then get. In fact, we now have an app that I don't know when it's going to be out. It's out. If you go to the app, what's it called? Price check. The app is, you can key in the exact item that you want to put there, and you put in the location, and then you will give you the exact price, actually, country by country or state by state, town by town. So all the 800 items, so that we in Malaysia become a little bit more educated. Returning back to the point that I know there are people that come out and say, oh, the world has collapsed. Cost of living has gone through the roof. I said, calm down. The world hasn't collapsed. It has gone up, but it's manageable. It's at 3.5%. It is manageable. But let's not simply, on the basis of that, forget the fact that we need to do the subsidy rationalization. We need to do the subsidy rationalization. We cannot continue along this path because that's a very significant drain on the fiscal position of our country. Those money can be usefully spent on developing our education system, making sure that we have the right public transport, and all other woes that exist in living in Malaysia that currently exist.
Stuart, over the long term, NGE will be an investor as well as an employer in this country. Now, with energy costs rising, with utility costs rising, and will continue to rise for the long term, wages, of course, are rising. So how does this affect your decision-making process when measured against the related benefits that come later on down the line when it comes to investing in Malaysia?
We are, first of all, we invest in technology so that we have fairly high margin businesses. And so we're happy to pay market, and when I say market, global market prices for electricity and fuel. We are opposed to subsidies. As I think Dr. Sri has made the point very clearly, subsidies is a very bad way of doing income redistribution because it helps everyone, including people in the middle class and upper class. And it's that's bad policy. The other thing it does is Malaysia's got huge potential for renewable energies here. But when you're subsidizing fossil fuels, renewables can't compete. So if you're going to build a renewable industry, you need to make people pay real cost for petrol and other fossil fuel related products. So I think that is that's critical. At the same time, obviously, you need to continue to do income redistribution, but it needs to be for only the people that need it.
Dr. Sandhu, sorry.
No, I just want to pick up on this. I mean, I fully agree that it's important that we replace the untargeted subsidies which distort consumption. It distorts incentives away from moving to renewable energy and more energy efficiency into more energy intensive types of industries. So it's just in general is the right kind of policy to do, but without forgetting to target better some of this assistance to the ones that are really needed. And to go back in terms of the issue of the fiscal policy going forward, I think that what is really important, especially for foreign investors, is the direction of policy. As we said, is whether the deficit continues to come down and whether there's a credibility that the deficit will continue to come down. And so for that, I think that the political will to continue with some of these reforms is also quite important. And then just finally, that we should also look beyond just the fuel subsidies in terms of the fiscal policy. That's good fiscal policy because a huge part of the government spending is actually outside of the fuel subsidies. But also, I think that it's important for the population to feel that there is a shared burden, that they are being asked, to help by not relying on the fuel subsidies so much, but that the government also tightens its belt in other areas outside of the fuel subsidies.
Dr. Sandhu, that's a very good point, because the historical standpoint when it comes to subsidies in Malaysia is the fact that the increases have been placed squarely at the hands of the consumer, high petrol prices, etc. But where the idea of subsidies may be perhaps examined, and you might have a view on this, is the fact that a lot of the producers, for example, just citing power generators, for example, PPAs, the first generation, of course loaded with loads of producer subsidies. Now, should Malaysia look at re-examining the way subsidies are structured in this country and perhaps dismantling some of those subsidies to essentially corporations who don't really deserve them in the first place?
That's a very loaded question in some ways, but I think that, as Stuart was saying, I mean, I think that mispricing of energy very broadly, whether it's fuel, whether it's the gas for the power producers, whether it's electricity, the only type of electricity subsidies that we support, that we find to be targeted, is the very small amounts to households, up to a very certain, very small amounts. Those, every household uses a certain quantum of electricity, and it's the poorest households that tend to use only that very small quantum. But beyond that very small quantum that only the poor households would use, it should really be market price for all types of energy.
Now, having established, I guess, gentlemen, the fact that Malaysia is on the right trajectory, we are still nonetheless very much a trading nation, and we are still very much dependent on the health of the global economy. Now, Dr. Sander, you've identified China as probably the biggest risk to Malaysia's northward trajectory because of the reforms that are taking place, perhaps the corporate bond defaults that are taking place. China is Malaysia's biggest trading partner. How highly do you rate the chances of a slowdown, or in fact a recession in the near future, and how much of that will affect Malaysia specifically?
I'm not the best person to speak on our China forecast, but I don't think that anyone expects a recession in China. I think that the question with China is, is it going to grow at 7% or at 8%? So I think that China will remain a very strong engine of growth for Malaysia and for the rest of Asia. But of course, because China is so big and has become so big both as an economy globally, but also as a trading partner for Malaysia, this 7 or 8% does make a difference for Malaysia's outlook. And one important way in which it does is also through commodity prices. As Dr. Sri was mentioning, Malaysia has done very well in terms of leveraging on what it has, and that means a lot of investment in natural resources. If the price of commodities were to come down because of a slowdown in China, that of course would have an impact on the Malaysian economy. But it's the commodity prices are notoriously difficult to predict, and I think that if we look at the futures curve, they look to be quite stable going forward.
Dr. Idris, perhaps we can just get your view on how resilient Malaysia is to a global slowdown, perhaps even led from China.
I think Malaysia is very resilient. For reason is this: if you look at the anatomy of our GDP, 67% of our GDP is domestic consumption. The bulk of our GDP is actually domestic consumption. More than 27% of our GDP is investment. So trade is actually a very small component, less than 5%. It's net trade. That means export minus import. So it is actually, although we are a big trading nation, the net trade is the one that comes into the account to determine how big is your GDP. That means export minus import, because we import a lot as well. And so if there's a global shock, we still depend heavily on our domestic consumption, because that is 67% of our GDP is domestic consumption. And secondly, private investment still are coming into the country. As I said, growing at 17.5% annually on a CAGR over the last 4 years is really robust. Then that is being very positive. Let me tell you my worry about Malaysia. We need to be fair about what we worry about Malaysia, and I do worry about Malaysia in terms of our net trade. Net trade means not good enough. So if you take a look at our net trade, our export minus our import, it's less than 5% of our, or 7% of our GDP, less than 10 on a good day. That is a concern. Now, what do we need to do? This Global Malaysia series is having this conversation simply because I worry about Malaysia. If we don't have goods and services that are easily exportable and we don't win it out there in the global market, then it's a problem. But it's not gloom and doom. Let me give 3 good examples of real Malaysians who are making it in Malaysia. And I cited it before for those of you who've been to the previous series, and I will repeat it, and I make no apologies for doing that. A gentleman by the name of Nick Azam, he has, and the wife, runs a small example of a small entrepreneur. They make tube amplifiers, guitar amplifiers. And this guy, he's got more than 20 workers, mainly Kelantanese. And they produce some of the best tube amp, and they sell it in 71 countries across the world. And so, I mean, this is fantastic example, a small entrepreneur that's doing it. And these guys, if you go to YouTube and type Chiria Tone, you see hundreds and hundreds of customers around the world who put in how good this product is. By the way, I bought his amplifier. I really love his amp. And when I ordered one via the internet, I was customer number 18 on the queue. I was so surprised when I eventually got the delivery to my house. When I looked at the amplifier, it's not made in Malaysia, it's made in Kelantan. It's actually, it talks about the Kelantanese. So that's one example of small. Let me talk about another example. Another example, medium-sized company. There is a company that produces hydraulic hospital bed. LHK, I can't remember. LKL. This guy, and I went to his factory in Serdang. When I went into the conference room, there was this huge table in there. In the middle of the conference room is the United Nations flag. So I asked him, how come you put United Nations flag, not the Malaysian flags? Look at that little gallery out there. All the countries in the world that we've conquered the market, I put the flags there. There are 40 of them. There's still more to conquer. This is a Chinaman company. All of them are Chinamen inside the shop. There's only one guy that is not Chinaman. The CEO is Mat Saleh. And so I asked him, how come? Because they said they believe him. When he goes to the foreign country, they believe him, not the Chinaman. So he hired a guy lah. So the point is this, because the key for Malaysia is to the large company. You find many examples of the big ones, such as Asia punching above the weight and doing many things outside there. But the point is this. The sad part of Malaysia is that we are vortex into quarreling about all our little economy called Malaysia lah. Good as it is, we're only 29 million people, small. But if you really want to become a high-income economy, you need to think about the whole market out there. How do we conquer the German market? How to produce a product and service like Nick Azam, like that guy just now that I described. And that we needed to do. How do we get the Chinese, the Indians, and the Malays to become one Malaysia, form a company to then make the most of what we have to conquer? But you can't talk about this in a government sense. It is us that collectively is doing it. And so how do we do that? If we all out here only are interested in government contract, that's old school. That is not the way forward. And that's the Samsungs of this world, the Hyundai, they are not vortex in that discussion about the small cake. Finland has done the same thing. Sweden has done the Swiss have made Swiss watches and they conquered the world doing it. That's what Malaysia needs to do. My concern about Malaysia is that our net trade position cannot move beyond until and unless we begin to do it right in our factory and right where we are. And that is the key. And let's not quarrel about the small domestic market called Malaysia. It's good for now, but that's not the game for the future.
Yeah,
Yeah, perhaps Stuart first.
Oh, sorry. I'm excited when I talk about trade. So, following up on Dato Shree's points and your intro, that Malaysia is a trading company, and trade is vitally important to continuing growth and prosperity in Malaysia. I'd like to add, we talked about whether if China slows, what that impact might be on Malaysia. But the big thing in China right now is they've widened the currency gap, and looks like there's a risk that China's going to go back to the old game of undervaluing the currency, which also has a significant risk to countries like Malaysia that have to compete. United States too, by the way, and my company. And what is a great way to combat that risk? And that's free trade agreements, like the ASEAN Economic Community coming together and the great progress ASEAN has made as a free trade area over the last 15 years. So you build in resiliency there. And then I would also say that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is also a great way for Malaysia to diversify its trading. And then I sit on the board of MITA, so I pay attention to where foreign investment is coming from. And as you probably all know, that of the manufacturing investment that goes into Malaysia, most of that is foreign direct investment today, and has been for quite a long period of time. If you want to ensure that you continue to get foreign direct investment, you need to join free trade agreements. That is the best single proof point that Malaysia is an open trading and investment environment. And TPP is I think, a great way to do that. And I was very pleased to hear the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago at his economic address support TPP in response to a question.
Good points, Stuart. Perhaps Dr. Sander, you had something else to say?
Yes, no, I wanted to pick up on the issue of the global champions, and also not to forget the services sectors. That Malaysia actually has some regional champions in the services sectors. I mean, one of the first transformation programs was the GLC transformation program, where actually a lot of the GLCs in the services sector, whether in the telecoms or the financial sector, have actually gone out of Malaysia and become more competitive and done better for that. I think that now maybe it's time for them to become global champions. Now that they've already conquered the region, can these companies actually become global champions and conquer the German market or go into the US market? And there is a role, of course, for trade agreements in that context. But I think that going forward, looking at how you can export more services is going to be important for Malaysia, which is a trading nation, to replicate its success in manufacturing towards services. And that's still not something that we're seeing. I was just looking at some of the figures for GDP in Thailand and Malaysia, and how trade throughout Asia has declined, right? Because of the global financial crisis, Asian countries which have been, very export-oriented, trade has declined throughout. In Thailand, actually has stayed flat because the loss in the trade in goods was made up by trade in services, whereas in Malaysia, trade in services also came down since the crisis. So I think that's another area that one would want to look at, and maybe one of the places to start is looking at some of the GLCs that have already become regional champions and how they can actually go global, and the companies that are still domestic, how they can go regional. Maybe some of the professional services companies, as we look at AEC 2015, how those companies, they should not be threatened by the companies that are coming in, but really look at the opportunities in the region for them to go out.
Dr. Sanders, is that wise? I mean, in the context of the current account deficit and exports being the engine of growth to drive the current account deficit in the right direction, should Malaysia really be focusing too much on services and less so on manufacturing, given the fact that countries like Germany and, of course, Japan produce goods of very high quality and which can sell for good premiums on the market?
Well, manufacturing and services are complementary. I mean, I think that people sometimes see this as a competition, but actually having, very competitive services help firms like GE. If you have competitive services, that it makes it easier for you to invest domestically and to have a good manufacturing base. And also, one should look long-term. I mean, the investment in the services exports abroad, it may look like you're setting up subsidiaries abroad, and if you just look, very short-term at your balance of payments, you might see, the investment abroad is higher than the investment coming in. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot of investment in advanced economies that goes out and perhaps more than comes in. And that's almost a characteristic of what is a developed economy, that you actually have more to export and more to conquer in other markets than you need to come into your own market. So I think that a healthy balance is good, and I would not focus so much on the one number.
Thank you. I just want to add to that. I just want us to be very clear. Many of us, sometimes when you look at, suddenly we see, if you see the Bank Negara report, the most recent one, you see two figures. One is the FDI, that means investment that's coming to the country. There's another figure called DIA, direct investment abroad. That means Malaysian companies investing abroad. The fact that that number is greater than FDI, you don't come out and say, they now don't have confidence in the country, so therefore they are putting it abroad. I agree with Federico. The fact that we are more than 50% or 60% of our sectoral GDP is actually coming out from the services sector. Services sector is not easily exportable. As you know, unless you actually go there, you don't manufacture something out here and then sell a financial service. You have to put up the bank there in that country. So that is what is happening today. It's a large chunk of DIA actually moving out there, investing in those other countries. As Federico had mentioned, we're still bringing in a lot of investors into the country. There's still a lot of investments in the country. As I said, it's a real increase in that number. But let's not condemn the GLCs when they start going abroad. I mean, so it's good for them to go abroad. There's a lot of numbers that many of them are beginning to do it, because we need to become global champion. In the world that is future, it cannot be jago kampung lah. We need to go out there and make it there, out there. So some of the companies, when they do it, you don't condemn them by saying they are now a traitor. They're no longer interested in our economy. They are going out there investing it because, so that's old school.
Gentlemen, perhaps the last question before we break for the Q&A session from the crowd, and it's really focused at leveled at you, Dr. Sander, in terms of what Stuart brought up and the China's decision to widen its yuan trading ban from 1% to 2%, and of course that perhaps makes people suspicious that China is back to its old game of devaluing the currency, which might spark off another round of currency devaluations around the world. Now, against Malaysia's position as a trading nation and against Malaysia's ambitions to regionalize, how much of a risk do these currency developments in the last few weeks, will it affect Malaysia's plans along this line?
Well, I would look at it more on a forward-looking basis and in the context of the tapering of the U.S. Federal Reserve. I mean, I think that everyone agrees that the exceptionally accommodative monetary policy of not just the Fed but also the European Central Bank, that there was something that was needed at the time of crisis, but that there was a time when this would have to be unwound. And as this liquidity is withdrawn, that of course has a lot of consequences for emerging market currencies, because if you have a lot of supply of dollars, then the dollars become less valuable. Now, if you take some of those dollars out of the market, right, the market tendency is that those dollars become more valuable. And because the price of the dollar is relative to the price of other currencies, that means that other currencies that may have appreciated since the crisis, they may actually depreciate. Now, the variation in different currencies, I mean, I think that would depend very much on a case-by-case basis. In the case of Malaysia, we saw that there has been some volatility, but certainly not to the extent of what we've seen in other countries. Of course, it's important to manage the volatility, and we'll see, how orderly this withdrawal of liquidity will be going forward. And there are some risks associated with that. But I think that as a general principle, the fact that the ringgit has been depreciating, actually that kind of helps jumpstart the export engine again, which will be needed to make up for the domestic demand, which might be suffering from the subsidy rationalization, some of the other headwinds. To the extent that the weaker currency helps the exports, there will be a positive. And I think that there it's really the less whether it's weak or strong relative to the Chinese or the regional currencies, because if you look historically, those currencies do tend to move pretty much in line. But how it fares with respect to the euro or the US dollar, which are the kind of the export markets where you want to get your products into, as those markets are now recovering and the economy there is performing better.
Gentlemen, thanks for your thoughts and your opinions. Perhaps it's now time to switch back to Frida Liu and further, field the crowd for questions. Thanks.
Right, we'll be taking questions from the left to the right. So if you could just raise your hands, and the paddle will be there for you, and just your name, the company you represent, and the question. So we'll keep it short and succinct. So on the left-hand side, we'll be passing you the mic.
Daniel Low, I'm from Dato Paul Lau's office. Question to Tan Sri about the sustainability. You mentioned it twice in some of your answers. One of the measures of certainly for sustainability should address the issue of upward income mobility of the less rich, and also decreasing the income disparity between the rich and the poor. I was just wondering, how does Pemandu measure that, if that's something that Pemandu does, and what initiatives does Pemandu do towards that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The first thing that was done was under NKRA, low-income household. We began that work under the GTP. We identified everyone who's poor, the hardcore poor. When we first started in year one, we had 54,000 families in this country who are in the hardcore poor bracket. That means don't enough food to eat. We reached out to every single one of them and got them out from that category. And then, of course, they're vulnerable poor. And so there's a lot of activities. The program that we have under the low-income household is Satu Azam. That means the element that's deal with agriculture, giving them all the aids required to help them in that area. And then Azam Kerja, finding jobs for them. So that's the third one is about Azam Niaga, small businesses, and Azam Hidmat. So these are the four components of that. So quite a lot of people. We have a list of 187,000 families that actually graduated from a lower category over the last 4 years. We monitored them under the eKasih program. We know exactly what they are. We register them. We monitoring the levels of income. So that's one. The other issue that has to attend to that is the rural sector, the inclusivity, sustainability. A lot of the people that are poor in this country are in the rural sector, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak. And one of the key things that is needed there is to provide basic infrastructure, simple roads that connect to them under our rural basic infrastructure. For what it's worth, we have built over the last 4 years under the GTP program 4,600 kilometers of rural roads. For those who know the geography, that's a distance from Johor Bahru all the way to Myanmar. And that's quite a distance that we had to build that. Electricity and etc. These are helping that. The third one activity that was done to deal with this was minimum wage. When we looked at the poverty line index for Peninsular Malaysia at 900 ringgit, we concluded that we need to lift everyone outside poverty line index. In Sabah and Sarawak, because the salaries were so low out there, and we put a lower minimum wage at 800 ringgit. Now, the point was this. Just by one stroke of policy decision that the government took, 3.2 million people were lifted out from poverty line immediately. I know there was tremendous, aggro in trying to do this. But we nevertheless did it in January. We managed to pull those people out. 3.2 million people, lives actually have greatly improved because they're no longer below the poverty line. That is good. Now, women is another issue, our inclusivity. And how do we make sure that a lot of women are participating in the workforce? Many of them do. Actually, they are smarter than the men today. Their grades at university are better than the boys. But many of them, obviously, some of them, when they are in the childbearing age, they get back to, they then stay at home. But we are now encouraging a lot more employers to become a lot more flexible in their policies to encourage part-time working and sabbatical and etc., all sorts of things like to get a lot more women inside the workforce. Now, for Malaysia, these are many, many things we still need to do. I would say today, an area that we really struggle in Malaysia is urban poor. And I really find this a real challenge. And if you, outside Masjid India, every week on Wednesday, we gather all those homeless people out there. And they come for the food that we grant to them. But really, many of them, they don't want jobs. I remember we got 10 of them 2 years ago. They were given jobs in Ajinomoto. They went to the factory. We gave them bars. We gave them housing. But after 5 days working in the factory, they all left, having stolen the mobile phones of their colleagues. But the issue here is that it's a lifestyle that they have chosen. And some of the successful NGOs have been really helpful in trying to build the spiritual aspects of them. And so that's why we in Pemandu, we're working a lot more now with the NGOs to reach out to a lot of this, the urban poor. And this is a challenge for us. Greater KL, we have 6 million people in Greater Kuala Lumpur. By the year 2020, we envisage that it will become 10 million. By the year 2020, Malaysia's population will be 31 million. If 10 million are in Greater KL, that's a third of every Malaysians are here. So if you have a third of every Malaysians are in Greater KL, we've got to improve our game in dealing with the urban poor. It's a lot better than we do today. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned from the various NGOs that are doing a lot of good work here. And so we're reaching out to them and see what we can do and work together with them and dealing with this. But the world over, I would say today, is a challenge everywhere to deal with disparities. And that is a concern for us in Malaysia. And we're reaching out the best we can. We're not perfect. It's work in progress. There's a lot more things that we still need to do in that area. We shall not give up on it.
Right. Okay. Over there first. Thank you.
Greetings. Peter Shepherd from Credo Trust. I'm afraid my question is also directed to Dr. Sri. It is about teachers' wages, salaries. You just talked about women teachers. I think there are more women teachers than men too as well. But and there are no women on the panel today. But anyway, my concern is, that when you benchmark against teachers in other countries, they're paid so much better. And our best doctors, engineers, doesn't matter. They were taught. And I think, just like your comment is, how can we uplift the professionalism of teachers without, a professional level of pay? Thank you.
I totally agree with you, but we have to take it step by step. You know, you shouldn't pay the guys who are no good a lot of money too. And so, but there's a transition we have to take. And you have to pay top dollars to get good people. There's no doubt in my mind, in one of the 11 shifts for the National Education Blueprint, we'll have to re-examine the entire remuneration system for the teachers. And that, I think, is a very important part of what we have to do. We need to get good quality teachers, and if money is what it takes, and that's what we do. For what it's worth, it's important to know today that if you want to become, if your sons and your daughters want to become teachers, the starting pay for teachers is actually better than many, many other professions in government. Higher than, I think, even an engineer. And some of you don't believe it. It's true. But so, sometimes the pay is there, but the conditions, the working conditions need to be right too. There's a lot more beyond the pay, and that's what I wanted to mention. The working conditions has to be right, the pay needs to be good too, and etc. But there's a lot we need to do on education. I couldn't agree with you more with you that the need to make sure all things we need to do. There is no shortcuts on education. We have to really, really work and to get this one going for the future of Malaysia. That's critical.
We have another question there.
Thank you. My name is Zaid Ibrahim, made in Kelantan. I'm also directing my question to you, sir. We have got a consistent change of policy. Every time we have a new prime minister or a new education minister, in a very fundamental way, our education policy changes. My question to you is, what is it that we have today that's going to show us that this policy, this blueprint, this commitment that you have and the Prime Minister has is going to stay? Because, as you can see, our English, science and maths, when the Prime Minister changes, we change that. When we have Malay, English, do you remember the national schools in those days? It's different, and then suddenly we got into all Bahasa mode and all that. So I just want some reassurance that these things will stay. My second question, if I may, is just this. Because we are going global, I remember asking someone from the government, if I want to go global, not that I am, but what kind of help would you give me? Because you have MIDA, who's going to have a lot of people coming here. So if I'm going out, is there any help? Is there any organization, or is it Pemandu that I should go and see Dr. Idris? I just want to know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As far as I'm concerned, I do accept the comment that you made, a constructive comment that we should stick to our policy on education and don't actually willy-nilly one fine day wake up in the morning decide to change it. And that's why the national blueprint is a much longer term frame. And it has not a 5-year program, it's a 20-year time horizon that we're looking at it. That said, it is important to think about education in 2 broad categories. The first category is the curriculum and the teaching method. That's the one that everybody wants to keep on changing every time you think about it. What doesn't change is the quality of teachers. That's a category. The operational side of implementing it. As I said, we have the same curriculum. How come Ululuba is better than all other schools in Sabah and Sarawak? That's nothing to do with different curriculum. Exactly the same books, the same curriculum, the same teaching methods, but the students are better. So that's in the second category. That does not change. And I think it's critical for us to make sure that category works for us. I was schooled in a very different teaching of English. We all were taught grammar before. What is a gerund, what is a past perfect tense. Today, the kids don't learn that stuff. But I wouldn't say my kids are any worse than me in terms of common English language. They were taught differently. But I think we should stick with the way in which we do it. And hopefully this time round, when we put the education blueprint, having spent a lot of effort thinking it through, and I think we will stick with that. Now, for those people that want to go abroad, come to any one of us. I think the best port of call is Madrid, really, if you want to do that, and MIDA. But come to Pemandu. We are only a small unit, about 100 people in my team. But if you have any difficulty, please call us, no harm. So, but the first port of call is Maida and also Madrid. They have offices in a lot of countries, 100 countries across the globe, and that's a good starting point. But I do want a lot of Malaysian companies to start thinking beyond our shores, because that is the future. That's the market that we really have to gun for.
Can I quickly just add? I think that you were asking about how do you ensure that some of these reforms stay. One of the things that has been very important is the fact that Malaysia is benchmarking itself internationally, that it took part on the PISA test in 2009 and 2012, and the results were not great, but that's the only way that you know that you're not doing so great and you need to improve. And you should not be embarrassed of that. I mean, I think that in Asia, people who are worried about losing face, but sometimes that's the way that we don't improve, is that if we don't confront what problems that we have and actually try to move them forward. So I would encourage that you should continue to measure yourselves, benchmark yourselves internationally, and then, if you're doing worse in Vietnam, let's figure out why, and then let's improve the performance. And similarly with English, I mean, I think that, as I said already, you have to keep measuring the level of proficiency and put it out there for people to see. And if the numbers are a little bit embarrassing, then that will prompt people into action.
Right, we'll take some questions from here first. Right.
Nick Zephyrs with the American Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. I serve on the Research Advisory Committee of the University of Malaya. At the most recent meeting, they announced that their research budget funding from the Malaysian government has been cut by 50%. 50% cut across the board for all research and development in Malaysia universities. We could talk and talk and talk about the future, but if you cut research and development in a country that already is one of the lowest in the world in R&D, and you think about these researchers that have started projects that are going to have to stop, the research projects that will never get underway, and the momentum that is broken, where's Malaysia going on R&D?
Good question. Let me put by saying this. We set up an institution called AIM, Agency Innovation Malaysia, and that's under the Prime Minister's Department. The first thing that they did at the time was they looked at all the research already done in Malaysia. I remember the book, we had something like 100 or 3,000 projects, all deliverables that over the years are already there. So a lot of ideas. And then we see all of those 3,000 ideas that came out through all those research, through academia, narrowed it down to 1,500. And those were then examined, and close to 500 were really, we think, they have scope for commercialization. Already what we've already making the most of what we already have. Now, some of those fine examples are, University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, they came with the right DNA so that they can now get the chili padi to ripen at the same time. So that is actually figuring out how to move the next mile, putting the money into commercializing those research, rather than do further research to come with another 5,000 projects that they don't have a hit rate for commercialization. And so that is the crux of what we're trying to do. Try to bring those many, many good research that were already there to bring them to fruition. And so there's another example of research being done already done in the USM, University of Science Malaysia, where there is a small kit, almost like the pregnancy kit. That using that, you can use this in rural places, and then you don't have to send the test to laboratory and for quite a number of tropical diseases. Can you imagine if we can then convert that, move that to become, to commercialize that, how big a market that is in Africa, in Latin America, and many other places. So there are so much of what we're doing today is to try, we're moving the money towards that area to try and commercialize this. And even in the private sector, another good example is the KL Sports Medical Center, Dr. So and the team. I think they are the most avant-garde country in the world on stem cell treatment today. And because they found out with atrophy, that means you harvest the existing cells from an individual, but with atrophy, that means you then simulate an injury around the arm, if that was the tennis elbow, for example, and then you put the stem cells. The technology is very, very advanced. His lecturers who taught him in UK, they are now coming here to learn from him. And some of the other people are coming out here. So Malaysia is already very avant-garde in a number of those areas. What we need to do is that we are now having to refocus the money that's available into applied research to bring them into the extra mile, the additional mile to make them commercialize. That said, we will always look for the opportunity for more research. But I think I'm less of interested in pursuing academic research that point to further research to be done for further research. We should then figure out how do you do real research that can help us bring it out for commercialization. So therefore, that I think is that's the crux of what AIM is trying to do.
Well, that makes a great lead up to my question, actually. My name is Eliza from Essence Person Mastella. I noted that GE is the main representation for corporate on this panel, and Dr. Sander, of course, brings the global financial perspective on how Malaysia is doing. I was very piqued by the development from the Pathfinder program about tripartite cooperation between the government, the private sector, as well as academia. So is there something in the works about developing the talent that companies require now to globalize rather than maybe pay off that's further down the road? Because the Pathfinder program seems to pay off very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's why we're having this conversation. I'm trying to get as much ideas from around so that we become part of the contribution to policy. I do believe that we really need to figure out how to do the tripartite work and scale that up. Get the academia involved, the industry and government. Currently, we spend a lot of money actually on vocational training, but they're not successful in the way that I painted the story around the Penang Skill Development Center. And I think that's a really good way to do it. So I think we can scale this up. I think there's tremendous scope for doing. Returning back to companies, I think you can't go and develop talent for the sake of developing just like that. It cannot come in vacuum. Let's say company A, they produce product C. They should ask the question, who is the competitor abroad? If the best competitor abroad is a German company that produces that, all day and all night you look at that and rip it apart and open every aspect of the German product. Check whatever they're doing. That's what Hyundai is doing. And that's exactly what Samsung is doing. They look at Apple all day and night. We should all day and night look at the competitor and examine the functionality and the speed of that product, everything. That is what Nick Azam is doing. For the last 7 years, he spent 16 hours a day figuring out the tube amp that the Germans produce and the Americans produce all day long, figuring it out. How do I do better welding? How do I then do better circuitry? All sorts of things to figure it out. And that, if you don't get the best welder, find the best welder. And if you have to get electrician to do it, get electrician. The key here is that until and unless the company come with the right customer value proposition, translate that to product specification, you cannot develop the kind of people require. So returning back to the point, take the example of that company. If you really need the best people because you now figure out what product you need to do to be the German company, then you can go down and say, I need to send so and so to this Penang Skill Development Center. It cannot be taken in vacuum. It needs to be taken at the shop floor. Management has a key role to play and to figure it out. You begin with a customer value proposition for the product, then you train the people. It cannot be done in isolation, in a smoke-filled room, in a theory like that. You really need to bring it down at the core phase for innovation to exist.
My question is directed to Datuk Sri. This is regarding fiscal consolidation. I would agree that in terms of the importance of having to rebuild fiscal policy buffers, and I also see that the fiscal deficit has been narrowing to now 3.9%. I've also taken note that the consolidated fiscal deficit, including the NFPEs, is actually a very wide 9%. So my question to you is that, have you really rebuilt the fiscal buffers? And can you please shed a bit more light as to the NFPEs what are they all about, should be concerned because the consolidated fiscal deficit is actually 9%. And a lead-on question to that is how much debt do these NFPEs have, and is this a form of contingent liability for the government? Thank you.
Yeah, we in Malaysia, we follow the IMF definition of what constitutes debt and etc. We follow strictly the IMF definition, like most countries. So our data, if you like, when we say we're below 55%, 53 point something, that is the official definition that applies across the globe in comparing them. So other countries too. So other countries that they have off-balance sheet items as well, they are excluded from the chart. Even if you did so, our numbers are still way below quite a number of the alarming other countries. So even if you added 9% on top of it, if that was the correct number, and it's still well below the 100%, the 80% as you see other countries. The key point for us is that Federico just reminded me just now, very important. Just like I described the story about household debt, you need to have household asset. So if you have government debt, you need to have assets that are backing it. They must be healthy. So we need to store, if you like, very good government assets, national assets that are healthy. And if those are toxic, then you are in trouble. You need to make sure that they're healthy rather than toxic. And one of the things that we're doing today is making sure that we focus on the 12 NKEs, because we believe that all the 12 NKEs, Malaysia has inherent advantages in those areas. And chances are, if we put our investment in those areas, chances are those assets will become a lot more positive rather than negative. And so I'm of the view that we are on the right path today. And clearly, we're not out from the woods yet. We are still, by the end of this year, we're planning to bring our fiscal deficit down to 3.5. That's the target. And by the year 2015, next year, we bring it down to 3 and gradually. So we are deliberately putting some tough targets, but we are committed to doing that and ensuring that we do deliver them. Of course, the game is you deal with the numerator or denominator. If you grow the economy a lot bigger, then, of course, that's a good thing. The good news is that for 3 years running, our government position, our government revenue has achieved record highs. Last year was record, previous year was record. So that's why when you grow the economy bigger, you have a record government revenue, you can cut your deficit. Of course, people can say today, if you wanted to have a surplus like next year, we could do that. We go and cut down a lot of our expenditure, but we don't invest, but then sacrificing growth. We need growth as well. And so it is obviously one thing for us to simply say, let's simply go and then want to have a quick surplus when you ask the oil companies to produce more oil and gas out from the ground, immediately we're in a surplus. But that's not the sustainable way to do it. So because you sacrifice future reserves. And that's why we're telling Tan Sri Samsul and others, they need to be out there looking for more reserves abroad to then deal with the one we already have. We have 35 perhaps years or so of future reserves for us, but they are really doing a great job. Petronas helping us do a lot more of that, the acquisitions made in Canada and etc. So I think the assets is key. So returning back to the point, healthy assets that is associated with the debt levels, and that's very important for us. And focusing on those sectors to make that happen.
Can I quickly just complement that? I think that I agree. I mean, a lot of the deficit of the NFPEs are actually investments, right? Petronas really scaled up its investment over the last few years. And investments means that you're also building assets. So I think that you'd have to see both of them in context. I think that what would be useful in the longer term is to have more transparency and disclosure in terms of what are some of the overall asset position of the government, what is the overall consolidated debt position of the NFPEs. So this is something that can be tracked over time.
Right. We'll start with some questions over there. Again, just a name, the company you represent, and the question. Are there any questions on the left-hand side? No? Yeah, right. Okay, we'll take the one at the back first.
Hi, my name is Lynn.
Let's go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lynn. I'm from Mesa Worldwide. We represent international exhibitions around the world. My first question is to be directed to GE Stewart. We know that GE participates in a lot of international exhibitions, and this is one way that GE goes global. So I like to pose the question to also the Malaysian companies into considering that they should go for international exhibitions. But for GE, why do you go for international exhibitions? And why do you think that this is a good platform for any company, for that matter, to be part of such international exhibitions? Second question is then to Datuk Sri, in which he says Malaysians should go global. So we think that, using exhibitions as a platform in order for them to want to go global, because we just recently brought 14 Malaysian companies with Madrid to the largest IT exhibition, in which they made 86 million ringgit in just that 5 days. So if that's possible, I think a lot of the Malaysians here can also use that as a platform. Thank you.
Great. The exhibitions are a key part of our annual marketing budgets. The obvious reasons are to obviously find new customers, meet with existing customers. It's a great networking opportunity. We'll also use it to introduce new products, new services. We'll be exhibiting later this week, obviously at the Offshore Technology Conference, sponsored by Petronas. First time it's here in KL, I believe, and we'll have a major position there. So it's a key part of our overall marketing.
Well, I agree with you. A lot more of the local companies should be out there, and you are speaking my lingo. Let's do it.
Okay, let's just keep the question relevant to today's topic. Yeah? We have a question from the lady up front.
My name is Yokpi. I'm from Lego, Malaysia. Actually, I'm not giving any questions. Just an observation that I see today. Talking about the talent, we know that teacher is very important, but have we done the recruitment right? Because from where I came from last time, I will hear that my moms or my teacher, they will tell me, your result is so good, you shouldn't be a teacher. Don't apply the marked up one. Yeah, you should be somewhere work in GE or Samsung, a big company. Yeah, so what am I referring to is, yes, I appreciate that the salary of teacher has increased. We are paying them well, but has the government produced, or not the government, or even the society, have we produced a conducive environment to make teacher as a profession that being respected by the people, by the society? Instead of just increasing the pay, I don't see it's really help to make it as a good profession that being respected. Yeah, thanks.
I agree with you. I want to cite one story about Teach for Malaysia. I don't know whether anyone Teach for Malaysia here. They're a fantastic small group of young people who decided to create this movement to get a lot of really vibrant and young people who believe teaching is a calling. And so they're out there, and fantastic. I became a teacher one day. I went to a school and I went to teach English. And so you can see that program, there is tremendous, there are people out there who would want to become teachers, provided you create the environment for them to feel that this is worthwhile calling. And so I do believe that I would have not given up hope. During my time, I had some fantastic teachers when I was a kid. And so if I imagine some of those teachers, they're really very, very good. And here in Malaysia, we have some really fantastic teachers amongst the 400,000. But of course, I do agree with you. That's related to the comment that gentleman behind said too. Yes, we can improve the pay, but the working environment and making sure that the self-actualization and the pride of being a teacher is also part and parcel. For parents out here, please, don't ask all of your bright kids to just become doctors and engineers to work for GE. Get them to become teachers as well.
I'm sorry to sound like a broken record on this, but if you move more of the decision-making to the schools, that means that you're actually also empowering the teachers. And that is also something that kind of helps improve the satisfaction of the teaching profession beyond the salaries. So this issue of decentralizing education is also something that is very important, including for motivating the teachers.
I know there were some questions. Yeah, The gentleman there.
Good morning. My name is C.H. Lim. I'm a freelance project management consultant. I just want to pick up on what Mr. Stuart Din mentioned about the TPPA. I just wonder, I'm puzzled as to why the government is pandering to all these objections and so reluctant to push ahead with this TPPA. And already it's not as though that there's no precedence. We have free trade agreement with China, and you know China is a factory, big factory, and we are not scared of them coming in with zero tariffs. And we have free trade agreement with Australia and ASEAN, right? A case in point is that right now I'm trying to bring in a very innovative building system from Canada, and it's like a chicken and egg situation. And this system actually, there are a lot of people interested in this system. You know, right now we are in a massive affordable housing building program, yeah. And there are a lot of interest in this product, but they say that, well, you haven't got any track record in Malaysia. You have to bring in this product and prove it here. Okay, but the next thing is when I go to the customs department, this product actually attracts 20% plus 10%. And that itself already is a non-starter for me. You know, I can't bring in because of the tariffs. Yeah. So I'm really wondering, why is it that if you want to go global, why is it so, we are so scared to open up the market? I mean, the best man wins, yeah? I mean, if the car import duty is a sensitive issue, that's a very good example, right? If we want to be globalized, let's open it and let the best man win.
All right, thank you.
I think other people can have comments. My view is that the reason why the TPP is taking a lot longer than the normal free trade agreements is because there are 12 countries involved. So when you have many countries involved, they look at their own interest in the negotiations. And also there's because when you're negotiating, you can't go and declare to the world exactly what you're negotiating, because negotiations mean you have to tapok samla. And so there is an element of people, what are you not declaring? But there are issues that most countries put on the table. In our case, in the case of Malaysia, we are concerned to make sure that our Bumiputra policy is kept. So there's some questions about carving that out. And there are issues around intellectual property, particularly in the health sector, and the intellectual property rights. The US are saying that quite a number of generic medicine, for example, they would like to extend the intellectual property beyond a particular tenure, which, you know, a lot of the medicines today, in the next 5 years or so, the IP rights are expiring. But if you extend it further, and there's a lot of issues around even the dispute resolutions, the international dispute resolution under TPP. Any private can sue governments across the world. And so government procurement. So those are some of the things that we, from our side, are considering. We want to join the TPP on the terms that we consider are favorable to us. If you look at the US, they are also having their own agenda too on agriculture and many other areas that they are interested. So when you start negotiating 12 countries coming together to produce a high quality multi-country trade agreement, it's a challenge. But I do believe that if we get it right, it's really good for the country. And so we have to make sure that all of the negotiations that we come out there, we know what we want. Our mandate is clear. Our negotiating teams look at the interests of Malaysia, but we need to transition going forward, and so other countries. And if we come up with a high-quality TPPA that is good for the world and good for Malaysia, we want to get that. We want to get it. But we need to make sure our mandate is clear.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Ravinder Kaur. I'm a banker. Now, to compete globally, Malaysia needs to create competitive and comparative advantages. The reality is that today, in Malaysia, the development of our SME entrepreneurship has been hampered by a lack of skills and knowledge, limited resources for innovation and technology development. And, you know, every country considers their SMEs as the future corporates that would drive investment, jobs, and demand, of course. Okay? So my question here is that in our reforms, apart from creating a real-world curriculum, how can the government create an effective focus to have hands-on training, vocational training, like you mentioned in Penang, but that's more piecemeal. Why can't we have it nationwide in communities like what US is doing now, Race to the Top, and they're having a lot of partnerships. You know, Obama is not just putting the house in order, he's, you know, ensuring that corporations now work together with universities, colleges, you know, and training centers to come up with the proper curriculum, hands-on training, and at the same time to follow the German model of a good apprenticeship system. Because by doing so, we would create specialized skills, you know, to produce, like what you mentioned, the Kelantan case, specialized, high-quality products and services. All right? Thank you.
We have many institutions in this country that does vocational and specialized training. As I said, 1,000 over with government funding. Eh? So there's no short of what we're doing today. There's Penang Skill Development Center. It's just one small example. But I think we have to improve the game for all thousands of them. There's work being done to examine them. It is an assessment, a baseline assessment has been made. A committee headed by DPM actually has been looking at this for figuring out how do we move forward and try to upgrade and improve the quality. And I agree with you that we do need to deal not just the academic side of it, but the vocational side of it. We've looked at the German models. A team has gone out to Germany to look at how they do it. And the South Korean model, if you look at the German model, there are a lot of them focus on the SME, innovation in the SME. With the South Korean model, they went out to the large companies. So we can do both. We can pick some of what they do in Germany. They encourage a lot of that happening at the SME level. But at the same time, we can also learn how to take a lot of what they do in South Korea to go forward. And for me, and I will make the piece here, and I don't think people will wonder why I say it. It would be really great to see some of our GLCs really start moving away from the conventional, traditional activity, but moving into the more sexy stuff. And so really figuring, because they have the money to do it. And after all, the conventional stuff is, people call it crowding out. Why don't we take some of that money and really move into the more high-tech area using the GLCs? Returning back to the point that you made here before, I think structurally in Malaysia, a lot of parents are now encouraging their kids to go and become an engineer and doctor, to become salaried. Actually, it's okay to fail, you know. You know, if you look at people who you can graduate but come out and do small businesses. So I think if you then have a large group of people who have a degree but come out to do small businesses, that's okay. Rather than all of us, you know, wanting to get the salaried jobs. And so a lot of people ask, how come there are not enough Bumiputra entrepreneurs? How do you have a lot of Bumiputra when everybody who's a graduate and does well want to become a head of a GLC? And obviously, when you have to do that, there are many good, successful Bumiputra, but they are salaried professionals. So if you then get many of them who will start at small businesses out there, then you will have an outcome that's looking very different to what we have today. But that's a structural issue about how do we move as a country. Necessary to do, but it's a lot more. I'm not whinging here, by the way, but I'm saying that as a country, I sat down in the World Economic Forum looking at other countries. They have the same difficulties as we do. But the point is, what do we do as a country? What do we then do to move forward and step out to do it? It's a collective effort. The government have to do it, companies have to do it, parents have to do it too. And that's how the spinning wheel will happen.
Thank you, Dato' Sri, and thank you everyone for your questions. And of course, the gentleman here, on behalf of the team at ETP, we'd like to ask the Dato' Sri to present a memento, firstly to Dr. Federico Gilsander from the World Bank. And of course to Stuart Dean, the CEO of GE Southeast Asia. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for coming to the Economic Transformation Program's Global Malaysia series and actively participating. So thank you once again to the panelists. Refreshments are served outside, so we'll see you again at the next Global Malaysia series. Thank you.